Hi, and welcome to our latest National Air and Space Museum live chat. I'm Beth Wilson. I'm one of the hosts of STEM in 30, a television show for middle school students that's produced here at the museum. And today I am joined by Dr. Margaret Weitekamp, who is a curator and the department chair for space history also at the museum. Margaret, thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, I'm excited to be here. This is a lot of fun.
We will be taking your questions live, so if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the comment section. We're going to be talking about science fiction today. We'll get to as many of the comments as we can, and if you tell us where you're watching from, we'll try and give you a shout out as well. Margaret, I'm going to get started with what may be a complex question, but I think it's important to get started this way. Why does the National Air and Space Museum collect artifacts related to science fiction? So why are toy rockets, robots, and ray guns important to the mission of the museum?
That's one of the biggest questions I always get. Why does the premier museum of actual aviation and spaceflight have this imaginary stuff in the collection? And the answer is really because this has long been a tradition at the National Air and Space Museum and at the Smithsonian, an interest in how spaceflight has been imagined. Because so often, in order to actually be able to design and build and fly things, you first need to be able to imagine it, to visualize it. And those visions often started in science fiction. We know that the people who were actually thinking about rocketry and space flight, many of them were also reading or eventually watching science fiction shows. And we love the interplay there between the way that people have imagined what the vision could be and the way that people have executed it.
We already have questions coming in, so we're just going to get started. We've got people from Cartersville, Georgia, Bartlett, Tennessee, and Prescott, Arizona watching, so please submit those questions. So to begin with, Marilyn would like to know if any of the Star Trek Picard props will be coming to the museum, and she also would like to know if you and Dr. Dvorkin would read Pluto's Secret online sometime.
Both great questions. We have not talked to the producers of Picard, which is the newest iteration in the Star Trek universe. I love what they're doing with that show, and I would be very interested in thinking creatively about what representations of space flight we might bring into the Smithsonian's collection. And Pluto's Secret is a children's book about the discovery and reclassification of Pluto that was co-written by myself and my colleague, our senior historian of astronomy, David Dvorkin. And the illustrations are really what sell it, and those were done by Diane Kidd, who's also at the museum. We love getting to bring that to the public, and yeah, we should do one of these where we get to read it.
Yeah, we'll work with early childhood and see if we can't set up a virtual story time soon.
Oh, that would be fun.
Brian would like to know, what innovation inspired by sci-fi do you believe is the most impactful?
Well, I think we're almost using one of them right now, which is that, I remember watching the Jetsons as a kid, right? And they would get these video calls and, Jane, his wife, had a little mask she could hold in front of her face if her hair was in curlers and she didn't have her makeup on yet. So I think one of the things is the distance communication is really critical. It's not only allowing us to continue to work in the middle of this shutdown and being able to socially distance, and yet still communicate with your friends and family and do the work that we want to do. But it's also allowing scientists to explore on other planets, right? We have entirely populated Mars with robots, and we use those to be able to look and see and explore and even dig into the surface. And so that kind of distance and remote sensing is absolutely changed almost everything about how we work and live.
We've got a lot more people watching. Brandon, Oregon, South Carolina, Southern California, teachers at Sellers Elementary in Jessup, Georgia, Toms River, New Jersey, Vineland, New York City, Columbia, Maryland, Las Vegas, Alexandria, Virginia, Alexandria, New Hampshire, Pueblo, Colorado, Lexington, Kentucky. And we're getting a lot of questions, so keep those questions coming. So Randy would like to know, are we going to get holodecks soon? Because they'd be really helpful right now.
I've seen a few people on social media who've been speculating that, this would all be a little bit easier. In some ways, some of the augmented or virtual reality gaming sets that you might have, our family enjoys our Oculus Rift, and then it's a little disconcerting to take the headset off and realize I'm not in a large, sphere. I'm standing in my tiny little living room. But I think we're getting closer to some of those. It may not come in the form that we expect them.
Rebecca would like to know which movie has the best time travel scenario in relation to current models.
Ooh, I personally love time travel movies. I was a big fan of Quantum Leap. I loved Terminator when it came out, just for the kind of the loop that it created. I always think that's interesting. The end of the second season of Orville did some fun stuff with time travel. So there are a lot of creative ways that is being used. We have no idea what it would actually look like to do that, but I think it's a sign of humanity's creativity that we can, as a linear species, imagine what it might be to be not linear, and then playing out all of the scenarios of how that would work.
This is an interesting question. Would you care to comment on the increasing body of speculative fiction by women of color?
I think that is a really exciting place where we're seeing more diverse voices coming into science fiction. I have been reading the Binti series and really enjoying that. I think that there is an exciting set of perspectives and point of view that come when you change who is telling the story. And we're seeing that in literature, and we're also seeing that behind the camera with some of the new science fiction movies and television shows. And it really is going to enliven the genre.
Ella, who is 10, would like to know, what is the weirdest sci-fi object in the museum?
Weirdest sci-fi object. I would say one that is very much of its time is we have a ray gun that is also a cap gun. The thing is about a solid pound of kind of pot metal, and a cap gun, for those of you who are too young for this, it involves a paper tape with little bits of essentially gunpowder that you would smack with a little metal hammer, and it would make a little pop and a spark and a little bit of smoke. And this thing just has wonderful kind of fluted edges and things like that. But I just think, if you bashed your brother with this, there would be serious damage done. And there's just no way that this kind of a toy would be made in this day and age. But looks like it was great fun if you were a kid in the 50s.
Well, maybe you should not give one to your daughter.
Yes.
Bruce from Eatontown, New Jersey says he knows that there is renovations going on, but he's wondering when the USS Enterprise model will be back on display again. And you might even want to comment a little bit about the restoration project of the Enterprise.
So generally, the entire downtown museum is in the process of essentially being torn down and rebuilt phase at a time. So half the building is closed, half the building was open when we were able to be open, and we're excited about getting to repopulate it with new exhibits. You may know that the museum holds the 11-foot studio model of the Star Trek Starship Enterprise, that prop that was used in the original 1960s television show. It has been a part of the museum's collection since 1974, since before even the downtown building opened in 1976. It had been hung for years. We took it off display in 2014 and did an immense conservation and restoration project on it and put it into a new custom case in the Boeing Milestones of Flight Hall in the South Lobby. and that opened in 2016. So it was on display for a few years there, and then now it's just been taken off display because that whole lobby needed to be evacuated and essentially gutted in order for the rebuild to be done. But we are planning to bring the Enterprise back in that same case, in that largely that same location when we reopen on the other side of all of this.
And we've got more people watching from Oregon, Maryland, Vermont, Illinois, Queensland, Australia, Sunnydale, California, Goodyear, Arizona, Sandusky, Ohio, Tampa, Florida. We've got a lot of people watching, so keep those questions coming. Let's see. Someone would like to know, where did you get your awesome Luke and Leia dolls?
Oh, so, I always sit around with an assortment of science fiction-y stuff next to me. The Luke is an original from the 1970s. I suspect that was given to my brother, probably as a Christmas present, maybe 1978, 79. Is not new in box, has been out and played in the lawn for a while, as has Boba Fett. The Leia actually was given to my daughter, and is one of the newer Star Wars toys. So I've really enjoyed the longevity of some of these franchises and the way that they've really been able to complexify their worlds, really build with new movies, new television shows, new toys. And watching then a whole new generation get to play with different kinds of characters. We've got Finn there on the far side, which also came out of my son's bedroom this morning.
And your Boba Fett is the oldest, did you say?
Boba Fett and Shorty Robe Luke, which are both vintage 1970s.
Okay, Ian is 9 and from Texas and would like to know, how often does Hollywood contact the National Air and Space Museum with sci-fi questions for movies and shows they are producing?
We get to talk to them sometimes as they're thinking about things. More often, we're talking to movies and television shows when they're interested in depictions of actual spaceflight. So on Apple Plus, For All Mankind, which is reimagining the space program, had some inquiries as they were starting to think about sets. And really, they are sweating the details of getting the mission control, the spacecraft, the hatches, all of that exactly right. And we're always excited to have that correspondence and to try to do what we can to bring the right documentation to creative filmmakers.
We're getting a lot of questions about if you have any sort of books that you would recommend. I think there are a lot of people reading. There's a library assistant who is looking for books for middle school students. Someone wants to know what you're reading, what your oldest children are reading. So are there any sort of books or book series that you can recommend for good science fiction?
Well, actually, one of the things that I was thinking about is the ways that science fiction really allows us to face our fears. Often science fiction, and we see this in the artifacts, but we also see it in the literature and the films, is one of the places where kind of as a culture, we work out things that we're worried about. So Beth, I'll do a quick quiz. When Peter Parker first became Spider-Man, how did Peter Parker what bit him?
A radioactive spider.
But if you've seen the new movies, what was he bitten by? Do you remember how that changed?
Was it altered DNA?
A genetically engineered spider.
Spider.
So something that we might have worried about, radioactivity, nuclear power, then gets changed into something that we now worried about. So I was thinking a lot about, I'm seeing online that a lot of people are actually reading and watching a lot of science fiction where we've imagined pandemics, where we've imagined epidemics and how we would deal with that, what that means in terms of community, zombie pictures, especially since, 28 Days Later, things like that in the kind of fast zombie era, are places where we work out those. So I think going back as far as Mary Shelley, The Last Man, War of the Worlds didn't actually start as a Mars space book. It started from H.G. Wells having a conversation with his brother about the impact that the British had bringing disease unwittingly that ravaged Tasmania. And so, at risk of spoiling a book that came out in the United States in 1898, those germs that exist on Earth turn out to be a vulnerability for the Martians that are trying
Right.
to attack. So I think the ways that that has been reimagined really have very interesting conversations with their present time. I'm a big fan of Steven Spielberg's version of War of the Worlds from 2005 with Tom Cruise, in some ways because the point of view is so narrow, right? We don't have any dramatic irony. We only see what he sees, and that feels very of that moment of people trying to figure out how they, in this very connected era, would deal with something that makes us so isolated.
Someone would like to know what you think are some of the more realistic science fiction shows and movies.
So we see some where they really are grappling with some of the realities of the science. So Matt Jeffrey's design of the original Enterprise is always a favorite because he was, in his own experience, a flight engineer in the Second World War. Gene Roddenberry had been a pilot, and so they created a spacecraft design that had recognizable pieces that have what Mike Okuda has called a, aircraft logic. You can look at it and say, that's an engine, that's a crew compartment, this is how that would work. And shows that then jump off from that have tended to take a little bit more seriously some of the jumps that are required in order to imagine ourselves as a spacefaring species.
What artifacts does the museum have from the golden age of science fiction? They're thinking folks like M.Z. Bradley, Asimov. I think even we just got some of the Clarke papers.
Yes.
So if you want to talk about some of those things.
So the museum is very proud to have Arthur C. Clarke's papers and archives here at the National Air and Space Museum, along with some of his artifacts. That was a tremendous addition to and deepening our collections in those eras. We tend to have more objects that come from comics or radio programs or television shows, because those are the kinds of things that spawn off toys, which are then a three-dimensional object that you can collect. I always joke, there aren't enough Isaac Asimov action figures, right? Which I need a thing to be able to bring into the collection. And so where we tend to have representation is where there were toy lines or things like that. A lot of times what the museum has, and I like those as really rich objects, are the commercially available toys, memorabilia, puzzles, games, mail away things, that those premiums that you might have gotten from your radio program for sending in a dime in your Cocoa Malt tab. Those things really, I think, speak not only to the popularity of imagination about science fiction, but to the ways that ordinary people really participate in that through stuff.
Walter would like to know, and I can help you a little bit with this, how has the museum integrated its science fiction collection in with STEM education?
I think it's a great touch point. It's a great point for jumping off, for asking people to think about what it takes to cover the immense distances in space. What might faster than light travel look like? What did faster than sound look like? And how was that developed in the 40s, 1950s, and 1960s? So I think that it becomes a great entree point for imagination and for the STEAM of STEM, right? For bringing the arts into our conversation with science, technology, engineering, and math.
And I think that when science fiction is really well done, then you can use that as an example. I always go back to 2001 Space Odyssey with a rotating space station. I mean,
yeah.
So you can, when the science fiction is good, it is good.
Yes.
So Central Florida would like to know what other Star Trek props or ships are in the collection, and we've got some interesting things.
So in addition to the Enterprise, there's a small model of a Klingon ship from the original series. Rather low fidelity. It was really used for distant shots. A small handful of tribbles from the Trouble with Tribbles episode, iconic Star Trek episode. And then a few really interesting pieces that actually that were fan created in the 1970s, in that little moment between the end of the original series, which went off the air in the late 1960s, and the moment when it was kind of rediscovered in the 1970s, because in many ways Star Wars helped reinvigorate the whole genre and get people thinking about bringing that back to television and bringing that back to film.
Will the museum ever have a gallery dedicated to various science fiction shows and their cultural influence? And this person is thinking about Ender's Game, Serenity, and The New Expanse, among others.
Ooh, very good. All good properties. I'd love to. Right now, we often have these artifacts in conversation with things from the real side of the house, and looking at that relationship. But some of the most popular exhibits in the museum's history, there was a Star Trek exhibit in the early 90s. There was a Star Wars exhibit in the late 1990s. My brother and I got in the car and drove to DC in order to see that. So there have been times there was a dedicated show of Robert McCall's art that then he worked, but he did that iconic mural that the museum has, the space mural in the south lobby in the entrance of the National Mall building, but he also did artwork that was used for 2001, A Space Odyssey, to promote that film. And so there's been a solo show of his imaginative artwork. And I think it would be a lot of fun. The challenge with some of the newer productions is computer generated imaging. And it's one of the places where there isn't always a thing to collect. Now, on the other hand, I've really been enjoying The Mandalorian. If you are a fan of the Star Wars universe, the newest generation of some of that has been done with physical models. I don't know if we will be able to get that into the museum's collection, but that's the kind of thing that I would be very excited about.
We've got people watching in Millsboro, Delaware, New Orleans, Louisiana, Milwaukee, Oregon, West Virginia, Virginia, Ohio, and Mr. Dixon, a fourth grade teacher, is watching from Albuquerque, New Mexico. So keep those questions coming. We've got a lot. I'm trying to sift through some of them so that we're not repeating. Somebody asked if you could comment on women authors who pretend to be men in order to get published, especially in this genre.
There is a long tradition of that. And one of the things that we've found generally is when you remove a presumption of sex or gender from a name, then people are looking more at just the product. And so there's a long history of women publishing under their names, but perhaps initials instead of their first name. So DC Fontana, who wrote for Star Trek, went by DC rather than going by her name and being easily identified. It's something that we've found in the science also. One of the things that has been done in evaluating applications for time on the Hubble Space Telescope is they started taking the names off of the applications and doing that kind of blind review and finding that it was bringing more young scholars, more women, more people of color into the mix because they were looking at each application really just only based on the merits and not based on academic affiliation or reputation. And that kind of blind review has led to a more diverse pool.
Mr. Dixon, who we just said hello to, is actually a fourth grade teacher in DC. He's not from Albuquerque, which just... he would like to know, what do you think is the best example of science in science fiction?
Um, I think in some ways, some of the medicine that gets done or the way that medical things get treated has been really a leading place that you see some of the hard science fiction really thinking about the body, about what's possible, playing with ideas of cyborgs or implants, things like that. The way that I think years ago that seemed very much like science fiction. Now we know lots of people who have had cataract surgery or knees replaced or hips replaced, who operate with pieces of themselves that are artificial. And I think that some of the medical technology that has been imagined is stuff that we now take for granted.
While we still have time, because you don't have a heart out, which is good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to give your quiz out and see if anyone has any ideas about how long it would take to watch all the.
Oh,
yeah.
yes. So I was thinking in preparation for this about the ways that science fiction has allowed us to kind of culturally face our fears and think about contagion, books like I Am Legend or Andromeda Strain. Richard Matheson's I Am Legend from 1954, Michael Crichton's Andromeda Strain that really propelled him in 1969, Stephen King's The Stand from 1978. But movies like 12 Monkeys from 1995, but also science fiction is a great distraction. And so if you're a fan of this and you're watching, some of the classics are really long, right? So now's your moment to sit down and watch 2001: A Space Odyssey from 1968, front to back. Sit down and watch The Right Stuff from 1980, over 3 hour movie. Sci-Fi, the channel, has made all 4 seasons of Ronald D. Moore's Battlestar Galactica free right now. So that's a great series with some complex long-form storytelling. The Star Wars universe on Disney, the Star Trek universe on CBS. And I will throw out the question and then I'll make one last plug, which is how long do you think it would take if you sat down like it was a job, 8 hours a day, and watched Star Trek, say from beginning to end, from the very first episodes of the original series in September of 1966 up to the latest episode of Picard that just dropped a couple of weeks ago? Think about if that was your job, 40 hours a week, we'll let you take the weekends off and get some sleep. How long would it take you to watch all of the actual content, movies, television shows, things like that? And if that is something that would interest you, I will also draw people's attention to the Smithsonian actually created a Star Trek and culture course that we have on edX right now. It's free. There's a charge if you want to get the certificate and be able to have unlimited time to take it. But other than that, Star Trek Inspiring Culture and Technology is absolutely free. It's something that I put together. It's co-hosted by myself and Scott Mantz, who's a movie reviewer out in LA, Movie Mantz, who brings unbridled enthusiasm and a deep, deep knowledge of Star Trek to the screen. And we were really excited to have many of the folks who were in the shows actually participating with us putting that together.
And I think we have that link, and I think our colleagues are putting those links into the comment section, so you can find that later. And we're going to wait a few minutes to see if anyone comes up with the timing of how long it would take, and then at the end, I'll let you give the answer out.
Sounds good.
Someone mentioned that what a fun exhibit might be to do the world of Star Trek makeup, and they're thinking about the Borg, the full-size Borg. They're thinking about Michael Dorn's whole mask. So do you want to talk a little bit about the makeup that goes into the newer Star Treks? I watched one last night, and the makeup isn't nearly as clean as it is in later ones. But do you want to talk? Do you know anything about what goes into that sort of makeup routine?
Now, you have to remember when you're watching the original series that was originally designed to be shown on a glowy little cathode ray tube that is probably smaller than or about the same size as the computer screen that you're looking at right now. And no one was anticipating HD and 88-inch screens in your own home. But that ability to do what the scholars would call, we talk about extrapolating and defamiliarizing in science fiction, right? Taking things that we know now and thinking about what they might look like if they kind of ran forward uninhibited in the future, but then also taking current scenarios and making them seem unfamiliar in a way that allows us to have a little bit of narrative distance to understand or appreciate the issues in a new way. And makeup and costume are one of the ways that we really establish that we're in another world, that we're defamiliarizing. Some of it can be as simple as there was an episode in the original series that had a world of half black and half white fighting against half white and half black. And that then puts stark relief on the civil rights movement of the late 1960s and racial difference, and making people start to maybe ask the question about what are we really fighting about? How different are we really? Because it seems very easy when looking at that population, that fictional space population, to see the difference. But a lot of very complex work has been done with prosthetics, with makeup, with costume, a lot of double stick tape that makes things seem like they are absolutely otherworldly and not easily existing in 1G. But part of what's fun with that is then the ways that that builds character for the actors and for the writers, of thinking about constructing an entirely different culture, perhaps even inventing an entirely new language to back up that culture, and then carrying that through with ridges on a nose or ear tips or prosthetics that add to a chin, or that change the body. I think, the work in Star Trek's Discovery with Saru as a new character in Discovery, where they've really taken advantage of Doug Jones' lanky frame and his athleticism and his almost seems more like ballet than just walking. And the way that that has really then added to what they did with the makeup, I think builds character and builds story.
Do you want to talk a little bit about, because I know that you have worked with some of these people that have created these languages, and do you want to talk a little bit about, what does it go in, what goes into creating a language, a whole nother language for a Star Trek?
So some of that started very ad hoc, adding a couple, making up some nonsense words. But by Star Trek 3, they were really thinking about developing language, and they actually reached out to Mark Okrand, who is a linguist, and asked him to really think through and create Klingon as a language. And one of the things that, I think to his great consternation, right, one of the ways to make it sound alien was to think about what combinations of sounds and grammar are least common in Earth languages. So I think people might be surprised to know how much some of these extraterrestrial languages are rooted in deep study of languages that are real on Earth. But he's building on a long tradition. Tolkien had developed Middle Earth and a whole set of languages in the Lord of the Rings novels, and really had used that to fully develop those cultures, those characters, and then to set the action in motion. So there's a long tradition in science fiction of the ways that language can then be used to make someone seem less familiar or more familiar.
And I just got notice that we do have an interview with Mark Okrand that was just placed in the comments as well.
Oh, excellent.
This is an interesting question. What is something that's real now that your 15-year-old self would not have believed that science and science fiction would reveal?
I think just a smartphone. Right. I actually remember having a moment in the 90s when I had a Palm Pilot and a flip phone. and thinking if I could get these things to talk to each other and have the numbers from this device just easily working in that device, wouldn't that be amazing? Let alone the ability to have it have, all of the apparatus of a GPS embedded in it so that it knows what direction my screen is turning, or also, or how to find me a decent cup of coffee if I'm walking through the city. It's one of the things that I've talked to Rick Sternbach, developed a lot of the props, and he always had joked with me at some point about a phone makes terrible television though, right? You need in the smartphone, you want the action of tapping a communicator, of flipping something open,
Right.
to indicate, to give the actor something to do and to indicate what's going to happen. And if you're just beeping at a phone and now I'm doing my taxes and now I'm looking up coffee and now I'm communicating with someone, it doesn't do for the action what you need it to do. So it's something that is tremendously useful in our lives, but is not necessarily. You need something when you're trying to tell a story that's going to move that story forward and not just have the person staring at their screen.
Let's see. In what ways has science fiction borrowed from real life? I'm thinking about how Star Wars used World War II films as reference.
Very much so. And I think you can really see in George Lucas's work how much he grew up on these action films in the 1930s, and was interested in what he could do to take that adventure on to an even bigger interplanetary scale. So I think that when you think about movies that have really done that well, again, it comes back to some of your fundamentals of storytelling and the ways that that then reflects what the culture is at the time.
Do we have any models from 2001, A Space Odyssey, or 2010?
Almost none of the models from 2001: A Space Odyssey still exist. Those, I believe there's one or two. I believe they're in private hands. It's an incredibly important film in terms of realizing a vision of what active life in space would look like. Imagining that big orbiting space station, imagining regular trips back and forth to the moon, with the space station as a way station, the way that you might stop at an airport. And I think that vision of 2001: A Space Odyssey was really very well executed, but at the time, people weren't necessarily thinking about collecting the props in the same way.
Right. Jack, who is 8, would like to know if there are any artifacts from James Bond's Moonraker.
Ooh, none in the museum's collection. It's a deep cut. From the late 1970s. That really comes out of a moment when the space shuttle program was moving off the drawing board into actual vehicles, but still a year or so before the space shuttle finally flew for the first time in 1981. And it imagines a shuttle orbiter as able to do all kinds of things that in the end were not what a space shuttle orbiter could actually do. But a fun movie.
Someone would like to know how the restoration of the Enterprise model is holding up.
So far, so good. Really doing well. The work that was done to stabilize the paint, to really reinforce and stabilize the wood center of that model was really critical. It's a model that was originally built by Richard Dayton. It's made out of wood. I think people always assume that it must be metal and plastic and things like that. And the least expensive, most effective, most durable way to create that was just to build it out of wood. The paint on the top of the saucer section is original. And so we really used that as a touch point. And then we've been very happy with how the restored and conserved paint job, decals, structure has held up, and it's one of the reasons that the museum is being so careful in how that object is displayed. I mean, it was created to get a shot in
Right.
the mid 1960s, and nobody imagined that 50 years later it would be a museum piece.
I think we're going to wrap up with this last question, and then we'll get back to your quiz.
Okay.
Elena, Nathaniel, and Antonio want to know, what did you study in school, and what kind of degrees did you get to work at the museum and to be in charge of this really cool collection?
It is a great question. I'm an historian by training. I have a PhD in history from Cornell. I wrote a book about a women's astronaut testing project from the late 50s, early 1960s, and that project brought me to NASA headquarters, where I spent a year in the NASA headquarters history office as a fellow working on that, and got very interested in space history. And on my own, I grew up as a Star Wars kid. I came to really love the Star Trek in the 1990s when that franchise was really booming. And when I had an opportunity to create a course when I was a grad student at Cornell, I created a space history and science fiction course. I called it Gender, Race, Society, and Space. And it was a fun way to bring some of the television studies, movie studies, popular culture studies that were being done at the time, which spent a lot of time on depictions of women and African Americans and other races in science fiction, and then knitting that up with the space history of the time. And that is really then how I got to the museum, and the opportunity to do that work with objects, to show it, not tell it, in a museum exhibit is really what gets me excited.
Do you want to, before we get to your quiz, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the other toys that we have that are very science fiction based, and a lot of them, when we reopen, you can see at the Uvar Hazy Center?
So this is a collection that existed for years, but it really got a great infusion from a very generous donation that came from a gentleman named Michael O'Hara, who gave to the museum in the 1990s over 2,000 objects. And it was a really premier science fiction toy collection. Starts with a great collection of ray gun toys, starting from Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon back in the 1930s, and then really runs up through. It contained lunchboxes and play sets and mail away premiums and all kinds of things. One of the premier pieces in that was, there's actually a play set from Space Patrol, which was a 1950s television show, and that was actually his set when he was a kid, and that was not something he had collected as a collector. And I was very pleased in the end when I got to work with this and to work with him, that is part of the collection. So those toys and games that tell us about how spaceflight has been imagined, and then how ordinary people have gotten connected to that vision through playing with these objects, through running around with walkie-talkies or a ray gun or playing a board game or carrying a lunchbox, I think are really powerful things that tell us about who we are and who we want to be.
Margaret, thank you so much. Let's go ahead, and I will give you the answers, the guesses that we got.
Okay.
We got everything from 10 years, 5 years, 4 years, 2 years, 1 month without sleep, 30 days, 23 days, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1,000 hours, 200 hours, a parsec. And then somebody answered, I used to work at Star Trek The Experience when it existed, and we play every episode in retail at the time, the early 2000s.
Yeah.
I promise you, guys, it's longer than you think, LOL. So do you want to tell us how long it would take you to watch?
So by my calculations, and this is based on a little bit of internet research, and is probably a little bit low because it's just estimating that most of the new series have had roughly 45-minute episodes, I'm counting 577 hours of Star Trek.
Wow.
So if you did that 8 hours a day and you never took a break, that would take a little more than 72 days, which would get you to basically Friday, June 12th, so the weekend of the 13th. But if you made that your project for a 40-hour week and you took your weekends off, it would take over 14 weeks, 14 and a half weeks, which
Wow.
would get you to the week after July 4th. And that's only the actual episodes, the actual films, none of the extras, no director's cuts, no Roddenberry vault looking at footage that has come out since then.
No cartoons.
Pardon?
The cartoon.
It includes the animated series. Yes,
Okay, it does. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
So, there's a lot out there. If you're looking to distract yourself, science fiction is a great place. If you're looking to kind of see some of the ways that creative minds have grappled with how we face our fears around some of these very big issues that we're facing, science fiction is also a wonderful and rich place to get right in front of that.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, I want to remind everybody that next Thursday at 1 o'clock, we will be doing these live chats until the museum reopens, and we will be talking all about the moon. So be sure to tune in then, and thanks everybody for watching. And Margaret, thank you so much. We went way over time, but I really appreciate everything.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. See you later.
Bye-bye.